Well, I hope many of you are enjoying your weekend off. It's one of those rare weekends where we actually have snow and rain that fits many people's stereotypes of what the Rocky Mountains are like. We're going to turn our attention now to, since we've finished up looking at emotions and how they actually operate and the theories that people hold, and also just stress and health. Clearly, I think we can make the connection between stress and health to the next topic in the next series of modules that we're going to look at, which has everything to do with personality and what we do with it. Now, we have an entire course centered around theories of personality, so I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail because you're going to get that into other classes, but I want to give you a grasp and an overview of the nature of the landscape when we're talking about personality. The interesting thing about personality is that really everyone that you come into contact with, including yourself, is probably an armchair psychologist. We all have our comments that we make about people, whether they're outgoing or a blast to be with, or quiet, or they're a nerd or a geek or whatever. All of those things are characteristics or traits that we oftentimes point to with somebody's personality. So when you're talking about personality, usually you will hear, when you hear people talk about it at all, is usually they'll talk about behavior. That's the outward aspects of it. They may talk about thought patterns or thinking patterns that somebody may engage in. And the last one will be feeling patterns that somebody displays. Somebody's very expressive or somebody's very inhibited. And essentially, when we talk about personality itself, that's exactly what we're talking about, is we're talking about a characteristic way that someone behaves or acts. So actions, we typically have a fairly consistent, reliable way that we act, how they think and how they see the world, one way or another, whatever the dimension is we pay attention to. And then finally, as I already mentioned, how they display emotions or feelings. And this is the characteristic way. It assumes a certain level of stability. In other words, the way somebody acts is fairly consistent over time. And you see this in characters which your book mentions, the characters that J.R. Tolkien developed in The Lord of the Rings, which the Hobbit movie is coming out this next month, and we'll get to see Bilbo Baggins again, and Frodo, not so much Frodo, but certainly Bilbo Baggins, and the prequel to The Lord of the Rings. And when a writer writes, he has to take into account the character's personality. And do they assume stability or consistency over time? And usually they do. We see some variations in some of those things, in some of the person's actions, but not as much. Generally, we calibrate off of interacting with a person a particular way. So one of the key figures, one of the looming giants within the of personality theory, personality study, would be the person that most people think of when you say, I'm a psych student at CCU. Generally, far and away, the first person they ask about is Freud. Have you learned anything about Sigmund Freud? And the group of theories that adhere to much of what Freud talked about are referred to as psychodynamic. Now, this may sound a little confusing because most of the time, if we're going to be technical, Freud actually is connected to the psychoanalytic school of thought. But it has morphed into what we refer to now as psychodynamic. And essentially, both of these assume certain things, and what they assume is an interaction between conscious and unconscious mind that produces what we refer to as personality. So between unconscious and conscious minds. And there are some things about this theory that are certainly, I think, we could confer or agree with. And essentially what comes out of this interaction is a variety of motives and conflicts that arise out of the interaction between these two component parts of our mind itself. So essentially, when we look at or think about the human mind, this is usually the metaphor that's used. We have the ego over here, which is really interacting with reality as it is. You have the id, which is way below the surface here, that is unconscious energy. It's driven along by what's referred to as the different principles. So what this is driven along by is the pleasure principle. The ego itself is driven along by the reality principle because it is the developing interface between the person and the world around them, and it has to live with the way things really are. The superego is really the moral compass of the mind, and it oftentimes grows stronger as a person grows older, and it's the war between the id and the superego that the ego is tasked with to try to resolve. And that what we see coming out of that is much of what Freud tended to talk about. So the method itself, Freud was a pioneer when it came to something that at that point in time was referred to as talking therapy. And he utilized a particular method. For a long time, actually, he was trained under the guy that we get the word mesmerizing, Anton Mesmer, who was involved with hypnosis. And Freud rejected hypnosis in trying to study people and reverted to something that he referred to as free association. And that is one of the key therapy tools, at least in the psychoanalytic point of view. And he basically thought that he could follow this domino effect of thoughts to the deepest motivation, to the person's deepest motivation to be able to untangle it. So he referred to this whole process as psychoanalysis. It came to be quite popular at the turn of the century. Anymore, psychoanalysis is not nearly as popular as it once was. And I already mentioned the key component parts of that, which is the superego in terms of looking at the mind. Most of it is hidden from Freud's point of view, but we have the superego, the ego itself, and the id are the three component parts. And it's what we refer to as a structural approach to the mind, because he postulates a series of structures to the mind that are theoretical. They're constructs. These are not real. They're not, you don't open somebody's brain up and it's labeled superego, ego, and id, but it is a construct to help one understand how the human mind actually operates. What the keys to, one of the things to understand about this is that because so much is below this surface down here, this is unconscious and therefore unavailable to most people. This area just below the surface is what he referred to as preconscious, and it can be accessed in a variety of ways, but it is accessible, but the unconscious is not. Oftentimes, Freud used or would examine people's dreams because he felt like dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. And we still have a lot about our ways of thinking that we see dreams as symbolic. My personal conclusion is that dreams actually are the outcome of a mind or a brain that is unleashed from the usual rules of thinking, and therefore that's why oftentimes they can be so fantastic in a lot of ways. Interestingly enough, if you were to watch the movie that lately that Leonardo DiCaprio was in about dreaming and about dreams, and the name of that movie has just escaped me. It will come back to me after I go to a new slide to fill out for you. So this is the personality. The structure of the personality is key to understanding Freud. Let's look at a few other details of his approach in the succeeding or the slides to come.